Good evening, class. You are welcome to once more our study, the study of Nigerian history, written by two erudite professors, Professor J.O. Aremu and Professor F.M. Adu. This topic is more or less important to every one of us, especially those who are part of this tutorial lesson. What the topic teaches us is to study Nigerian history and from the past, from the period that is before 1960, when Nigeria got its independence. And the objectives of this lecture is simply simple. First is to examine the historical development of Nigeria. To interrogate the geographical and environmental issues in conjunction with the cultural and linguistic affiliation. To interrogate the geographical and environmental issues in conjunction with the cultural and linguistic affiliation. To analyze economic and religious intervening factors and discuss military incursion into state politics, and also investigate and highlight the democratic processes and foreign reforms. This is what we are going to emphasize on when it comes to our study of Nigeria. Our lecture should not be that long because, of course, it's more or less a tutorial, which I believe every one of us should learn from. We will go to the historical development of Nigeria. From what the authors have said, Nigeria have about 250 ethnic nationalities, and the amalgamation of the place we call Nigeria today began in the year 1940, and that was the amalgamation of the Northern and Southern Protectorate. Although before that period, in 1906 to be precise, a place called Lagos merged with the Southern Protectorate. So if you look at it from this perspective, the entity or the nation called Nigeria truly began its journey from the year 1914, when the colonial masters, and if you may ask who are the colonial masters, they are the British, brought groups of empires, tribes, nationalities together and meshed them together and made them one entity. Hence, the name Nigeria emerged. It is believed that the name Nigeria must have been suggested by a certain lady called Flora Shaw. And Flora Shaw more or less gave the name Nigeria to those who today call themselves Nigeria. And from then on, Nigeria prepared itself through the process of some form of independence as directed by the British. They started with the Clifford Constitution, which commenced in 1922, the Richards Constitution 1946-47, the Maferson 1951, the Lenington 54. All are the processes in which that entity or that nation, Nigeria, was made to go through. Nigeria, as a nation, had, as I've said, a lot of nationalities. Today we talk about people, River State and all that, Akwa Ibom, Plateau, Katsina, all these places, Kwara, Borno, all these places are considered to be Nigeria. And Nigeria as an entity from Lagos to Maiduguri and all that, you could see that as an entity, Nigeria is indeed a very big place. And geographically, Nigeria lies east of a place called the Benin Republic, south of Niger, Chad Republic, west of the Republic of Cameroon, north of the Gulf of Guinea. So these are the borderlines. This is where those places I mentioned is where Nigeria, the borders of Nigeria lies. So you could see that these are where the Nigerian borders lies. And geographically, Nigeria had different belts, the Savannah belt, the forest belt, and all that. So you could see that Nigeria is indeed, in terms of geography, we had is our own Nigerian belts, which is dictated by the environment. And in terms of natural resources, Nigeria is indeed blessed. In terms of natural resources, Nigeria is indeed blessed. Nigeria is blessed with gold, limestone, tin, columbite, kaolin, silver, so many things in which Nigeria is indeed blessed with. Gypsum, gas, natural gas, crude oil, which I guess all students should know about. So in terms of mineral resources, Nigeria as an entity is indeed a very blessed country. Very few nations in the world could be as rich as the nation called Nigeria. And in terms of cultural and linguistics groups, Nigeria has groups such as Yoruba, Igbo, Hausa, Ibibio, Fulani, Nupe, and so many, Jokun, Ijaw, Ishekiri, Benin, and so many linguistics groups. And so many of these groups have their own various languages which they speak. And these languages which they speak are quite distinct and different. Some are even grouped into various groups, such as the Chadic and many other linguistic distinctions, which makes Nigeria a very special place. And if you must understand the entity or the country called Nigeria, so many groups lie within the geographical location of Nigeria. And those groups have their past. So this means that even before 1914 or even 1960, people, these groups, with their culture, with their history, with every other thing, had stayed in the society called Nigeria, or which we later know they've been able to stay in the society called Nigeria, which we later know as Nigeria. And in terms of religion, Nigeria has, before the 19th century, a lot of polytheist religious beliefs, worship of one god or the other. But after the 1804 jihad, for instance, although Islam had come to Nigeria quite before 1804, the Uthman Fodio jihad revitalized Islam in Nigeria. And as such, Islam came to some of the northern places in Nigeria. It's not all, but Islam was there. And sects such as the Tanzania, Quadria, Sufism, and all that became a dominant religion, especially in northern Nigeria and some places in southern Nigeria. Then later on, because of the activities of the British, the Christianity also came to Nigeria. And with Christianity coming to Nigeria, groups such as the Methodists, Catholics, Anglican, and all that emerged and came into the society which we know as Nigeria. So you could see that from all this, that Nigeria as a group, as an entity, as a state, have had its own past even before the coming of the colonial masters. I must let us know that even before the coming of the colonial masters, empires that these linguistic groups that came forth from these linguistic groups had thrived. For instance, we used to have the Benin Empire, the Oyo Empire, and even the Hausa tribes. We have groups that were thriving in economy, in politics. They were ruling each other properly, and in every aspect that you may look at. But the coming of the British, at first, the British came with other Europeans through the sea, traded with Africans and Nigerians, most especially through barter exchange. And at the beginning, most of it was dominated by the slave trade. But after the slave trade came the legitimate trade. After the legitimate trade came the colonialism. And hence, from then on, Nigeria as an entity continued to thrive and move on. But in 1960, Nigeria was able to get its independence. The independence Nigeria got in 1960, which means independence which can be considered as political. Although Nigeria got its political independence, some historians will say, even though we got political independence, that independence was not one that could be related to economics. Nigeria still depended on Europe and other societies in the world for trade and all that. But politically, we could claim that we have our own leaders who now rule us. And Nigeria had its independence in 1960. And from then on, we started that political process, which I mentioned, which started through the Clifford Constitution, Richards, Maferson, Leamington, and all that. But that culminated in 1960s to our independence. And with that independence, Nigeria started a parliamentary system of government. Our first prime minister and only prime minister was a man called Tafawa Balewa. And Tafawa Balewa became our prime minister, the head of government, which also the ceremonial head was a nationalist called Nnamdi Azikiwe. And this generated from the victory of a political party called the Northern People's Congress, the NPC, which was now the senior partner in that alliance between two political parties. Joined with the NPC was the NCNC, which became the junior partner. So, of course, you could understand by senior and junior partner, MPC senior partner, NCNC junior partner. Both in that coalition ruled Nigeria between 1960 to 1966. In 1966, some group of soldiers took over Nigeria, led by a man known as Kaduna Isiagu. With Isiagu coming coup, although the funny thing about that coup is that those who led the coup were not those who later ruled. Even though Isiagu led the coup, people like Ifejuna and co were part of the coup. Those ones were not the ones who ruled. Instead, the highest ranking officer in the Nigerian army, Aguiyi-Ironsi, became the head of state. Because technically that coup failed. And the highest ranking officer, Aguiyi-Ironsi, took over power. But with the victory, with Aguiyi-Ironsi becoming the head of state, 6 months, 7 months after, July 29 to be precise, another coup did happen. This in history is called the counter coup. And the counter coup was led by a group of northern officers. And these ones removed those who were part, or those who were leaders of the first coup, or leaders of the government in power in 1966, between January and July. People like Aguiyi-Ironsi, Fajuyi, and co were killed. And when they were killed, another group of soldiers came into power. And this group of soldiers who came into power created a lacuna and a dispute, which culminated and ended up in the Nigerian Civil War. And that alliance that happened during the parliamentary system between majorly the northern part and the eastern part became one of distrust and crisis between both groups. Powers from the north, who had taken over now, were not in agreement with some elements from the east, such as Odumegwu Ojukwu and co., which later culminated in what we know as the Nigerian Civil War. That war was on for 3 years, although the person who was head of state during this period, who took over from Aguiyi-Ironsi, was Yakubu Gowon. Yakubu Gowon ruled throughout the Civil War, and at the end of the Civil War, Nigeria won over Biafra. And with the victory over Biafra, that victory became the end of the Nigerian Civil War. Biafra, Ojukwu, leaving the country, and his deputy giving power back to Nigeria, and Nigeria remained one and not a broken entity if the Civil War had favored Biafra. And Gowon ruled up to 1976. Up to 1975, sorry. And with Gowon ruling, power was taken over from Gowon. Although power that was taken over from Gowon was led by another military man called Muritala Muhammad. Muritala Muhammad, taking over power from Gowon, created another lacuna, which could be considered as the Hausa Fulani hegemony group versus those from the Middle Belt. Those who ruled through Gowon were considered as sympathizers of the Middle Belt. And the Hausa Fulani group of Murtala Muhammad took over. And with the victory, with the coup being successful of the Murtala Muhammad, the deputy being Olusegun Obasanjo, the two ruled, although Murtala was killed February 13, 1976, and Olusegun Obasanjo took over from him. And in 1979, an experiment of democracy was also made, a presidential system of government, where Shehu Shagari became the president. But for 4 years, led by a political party called the National Party of Nigeria, NPN, and the opposition parties then were UPN, GMPP, PRP, and all that. With the opposition party trying to struggle for power, but lost in an election in 1979. And Shehu Shagari became the president. Alex Ekweme became the vice. With Alex Ekweme becoming the vice and Shehu Shagari the president, they were only able to rule for about 4 years before Muhammadu Buhari, again a military man, took over power in 1983, December. And he ruled for 2 years. In 1985, another military man took over power, Badamasi Babangida, General Badamasi Babangida. With Badamasi Babangida taking over power, he ruled for 8 years. And he tried handing over to civilians, but the election he himself conducted, he said it was not perfect enough. And instead, he handed over to an interim government led by Ernest Shonekan. With Ernest Shonekan taking over power for about 3 months, that was for some time. The interim government, that democratic system was truncated again. And a man called Sani Abacha took over power. With Sani Abacha taking over power, Abacha ruled from 1993 to 1998, when he died and Abdul Salam took over power. He ruled till 1999, and a democratic process came up. And in that democratic process, a new experiment for democracy began. What originally was what the colonial master had intended, but failed because of the truncation by the various military leadership. And in 1999, the PDP took over power, and Obasanjo ruled for 8 years, handed over to Yar'Adua, who died in 2009. And when he died, power was given to a man called Goodluck Jonathan, who ruled up to 2015. Muhammadu Buhari taking over in 2015 and ruled for another 8 years. And now we have the new president now, who is still presently there, Bola Ahmed Tinubu. So you could see that Nigeria had indeed gone a long way. From the period before the colonial period, where empires and groups thrived a lot. We had empires such as the Benin Empire, the Oyo Empire, and the other empires. The Jaws were there and all that. The Shekiris were there, they were thriving. And all these empires had their leaders they were doing so well. In fact, at one time, Benin was considered by a Dutch to be as beautiful as Amsterdam. So we didn't really, were not doing so badly. But the coming of the Europeans to the African plains, most especially Nigeria, changed it all. Started with some form of barter trade with them, which culminated into what we call the slave trade, dominating it, even though other forms of trade were still going on. Of course, we all know the impact of the slave trade, how blacks were taken to Europe and America, sold like goats and cows, and the strongest of Africans were sold to develop the places you know as Europe and America today. Their blood were part of those that was used to develop those cities. And that was on for about 300 years before the legitimate trade, which legitimate trade is trade of goods with goods, not humans with goods. And with the legitimate trade, that also continued for some years before the Europeans, the British, decided in a place called Berlin to carve Africa into various enclaves, and so many of them laying hold on it. That's why today you hear Francophone Africans, Anglophone Africans, Lusophone Africans, depending on who is your colonial masters. And these ones were the ones who held power for that, who were able to take charge of the various enclaves we know as Africa today, except for few nations such as Ethiopia, who could not be colonized by this group of people. Every other groups, Egypt, Nigeria, South Africa, all these groups were colonized in one way or the other. And after that colonialism, which happened for some periods in the 20th century, for Nigeria it was up to 1960. We got our political independence, but that political independence did not culminate into economic independence. Just as I've explained, Nigeria's, in terms of mineral resources, are not very rich, but this has not been able to have so much influence on its citizens. And since then, this democratic trial has started. We struggled and struggled up to 1999, but since then, we have been able, to some extent, get it right democratically. Although there are those who still complain that the Nigerian state democratically is not thriving as expected. Although there are very many school of thoughts which is for or against such things. So, students, you have been able to get a short history of that nation called Nigeria, and how this nation called Nigeria has thrived for 300, 400, 500 years ago. Our religious background, we were polytheists before we ended up with the Abrahamic religion. And since then, a large population of Nigeria has either been Muslim or Christian. I must let us know that don't get carried away by the narration of the media, the Muslim North and the Christian South. There's a lot of Muslims in the South and a lot of Christians in the North. But the media continues to push such narration. And that narration could be traced to the Nigerian Civil War, when Biafra is trying to paint the North to be quite genocidal. So they made the South look Christian and made the North look Muslim. But that analogy is not 100% right. There's a large population of Muslims in the North. Yes, I agree. There's also a large population of Christians in the North. There's a large population of Christians in the South. Yes, I agree. There's also a large population of Muslims in the South. So you can see that we are intertwined in one way or the other. But with this little narration of the history of Nigeria, I think you students would more or less be able to do your readings on your own and study more. Any question before this tutorial ends? Any question? I'll give 2 minutes to ask if you have any question. Any question? Any question? Any question? Class ends here today. Thank you.